Thank you very much to Gordon. I'm delighted to be chairing this panel, US Global Leadership on Democracy. We're going to start, I'm joined by Kurt Volker, former United States Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations and, of course, former Ambassador to NATO. But before we start our discussion, we're going to hear a video message from Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader. So tune in to the screen.
Hello, I'm Senator Mitch McConnell, Republican leader of the U.S. Senate. It's an honor to be speaking to friends and allies at such a pivotal moment. Today, we're facing grave threats to the prevailing international order that the United States and allied democracies fought to establish after World War II. It was a decade ago, as Russia's Little Green Men invaded the Crimea and Donbass regions of Ukraine, that then NATO Secretary Rasmussen warned allies that it was time to take the obligations of collective defense more seriously. As he put it, in the long run, a lack of security would be more costly than investing now. Of course, the distinguished host of this summit was exactly right. 2 years ago, as Putin escalated his invasion of Ukraine, we saw that too few of our allies had heeded this prescient advice. To many of the world's most advanced, prosperous, and capable societies had fallen asleep to the basic requirements of their own security, let alone the collective demands of the transatlantic alliance. As a committed advocate for NATO, that's why I went to meet allies in Munich last year. The holiday from history was already over, but some of its habits lingered. I thought it was important for the future of transatlantic security cooperation that I convey the strength of the bipartisan resolve here in Washington. And it was essential that allies on both sides of the Atlantic acted on the lessons of war in Ukraine, from recognizing the growing coordination among our adversaries to making the urgent investments required to meet them. Today, the United States continues to make necessary but insufficient progress toward addressing our own national security needs. As you know, we just approved a major supplemental investment in both the frontline defenses of our allies and partners and in our own capabilities and defense industrial capacity. I was proud to lead this effort and demonstrate to the world that America's commitments carry weight, and I was particularly proud that in the process of delivering these resources, support among my fellow Republicans in the Senate actually grew. A significant majority of my party voted for this legislation despite significant differences with the President's party on foreign policy. Soon, we expect cutting-edge U.S. capabilities to reach the front lines in Ukraine, backfilling Israel's defenses, and helping equip Taiwan and other vulnerable Asian democracies to face down future aggression. But for the purposes of the transatlantic alliance, the why is just as important as the what. America isn't making major investments in the arsenal of democracy out of a sense of charity. We're not backing allies and partners out of some theological belief in the so-called rules-based international order. We're doing it because the rules of the international system are not self-enforcing. The prevailing order will not lead or preserve itself. We're reinvesting in hard power because it's in our clear national security interests to do so. And the same must be true of our allies. The authoritarian regimes that want to undermine Western peace and prosperity are working together. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, and a web of terrorist proxies are aiding one another's attempts to weaken us all. Maintaining the security and stability of our closest trading partners is in America's interest. So is standing with an ally fighting terrorists who want to erase it from the map. So is deepening security cooperation with friends threatened by Chinese aggression. so is upholding the fundamental principle of freedom of navigation. And so is rebuilding our capacity to credibly deter threats or to decisively defeat them if deterrence fails. Of course, this same calculus should apply to our closest allies. If holding Russian aggression at bay in Ukraine is in your interest, then so is investing in the industrial capacity to rebuild your own credible defenses. And if reducing reliance on Russian energy is in your interest, then so is reducing reliance on Chinese technologies and making your economies resistant to Chinese predation and espionage. Our friends in the Indo-Pacific are showing by their words and their actions that they understand what Russian aggression and European instability mean for their own futures. The transatlantic alliance must recognize the threats running in the opposite direction as well and act accordingly. China is a systemic rival, whether we choose to acknowledge it publicly or not. Hardening our economies and supply chains is not just a good idea, it's urgently necessary. Rebuilding capable militaries backed by well-resourced industrial bases is not a task for tomorrow. I'm very encouraged by European allies' commitments to change how they invest in their defenses. But the challenge before us is to do even more, to do it faster, and to build these investments into base budgets, not ephemeral special funds. We need to reform our defense bureaucracies to move at the speed of relevance. We need to incentivize our industries to expand production lines for critical military capabilities. And we need to work more closely together as allies to share defense technology and improve interoperability. The decisions allies are making right now are determining the course of today's fight against Russian aggression and tomorrow's challenge of preserving peace in the Pacific. So I'll continue to champion the sort of American leadership that has guided the transatlantic alliance for decades. But I'm proud to stand with our allies at the cusp of even deeper commitments to facing down global challenges together.
So, Ambassador Volker, some interesting points there by Mitch McConnell. Let's start with his comments about the congressional package that was finally passed in Washington. Now, he did make the point that, a significant majority of his party did vote, but as we know, Mitch McConnell is representing one particular wing of the Republican Party, a Republican Party that's becoming increasingly isolationist, it seems, from the outside. Where do you assess Republican Party and the US support for Ukraine now that we've got this bill passed? What happens next, and do they need to do more?
Well, several things. First off, let me just say thank you to Anders Fogh Rasmussen and the organizers here for inviting me and for having this. It's a pleasure to be here in person. First off, there is a majority of the public and even a majority of Republican voters who continue to support Ukraine and are very much suspicious of Russia, concerned about Russia. And they see the linkages between Russia's aggression against Ukraine, Hamas' aggression against Israel, Chinese threats against Taiwan. It is Iran that is supplying Russia with drones. It is North Korea that's supplying artillery shells to Russia. So they see the connections here, and they are concerned about it, and they do support a country like Ukraine that is fighting for freedom. That does not mean, however, that we don't have politics in the U.S., where people have a variety of different interests and concerns. When we had the vote in the House to pass the aid to Ukraine, I think it got 311 votes out of 425. That is a substantial majority. Now, more Republicans voted against than in favor, but that is because we haven't done anything about the southern border. And that is what most of the Republicans were saying is, we're for aid to Ukraine. We want to support this, but we have to get something done about our own security as well. And until we see that, we can't vote in favor. Even with that point of view, the bill passed overwhelmingly. Speaker Johnson brought it to the floor knowing it would pass. Former President Trump gave a lot of political cover to Speaker Johnson to get him through this without a small minority of congressmen threatening his speakership. So it's tough, it's democracy, it's a messy process, but in the end, I think America is still there for Ukraine.
What about America under President Trump for the second time? I was a journalist in Washington during the Trump years. I remember it well. What do you expect from a potential second Trump presidency? Obviously, we've all seen the comments from Trump encouraging Putin to essentially attack NATO allies, talking about the relevance of NATO. I mean, do you expect Trump to accelerate some of those sentiments we saw his first term and move to some of these points?
Well, that comment, and I remember seeing you in Munich, and we talked about that. That comment drew a lot of attention. Maybe it's good to put it in context. He was speaking to a campaign rally, and he was bragging about what he said to a European leader when he was president 5 years before. It was not a statement that he would tell Putin this now. We don't even know if it's true, whether he actually said this or if he was just bragging.
Yeah.
And we don't even know if he said that to Putin or not. So take that as a grain of salt. But what's more important is after that, he deliberately did an on-stage Q&A like this with Nigel Farage, where he flipped it around. And he had Nigel Farage ask him if a country had spent its fair share and was treating the U.S. fairly, as they spent 2% of GDP, would you come to their defense? And he said 100% absolutely. So he was deliberately correcting the way that came across. He also, just last week, said I love Europe. I love Europeans. I don't want anything bad to happen to Europe. So he's trying to massage this a little bit, but what he's also trying to do is really push hard for Europeans to pay 2% plus of GDP on defense. And a lot has changed since when he was president before. Putin is now fully unmasked in his imperialist and genocidal aggression against Ukraine. That wasn't the case in 2016. In addition, Ukrainians have stood up truly to fight for all of us, to fight for freedom, to fight for Europe. And that wasn't exactly seen that way back in 2016 and 2017 either. And he doesn't want to be in the position of being weak or being a loser. He wants to operate from a position of strength. And I think that's why he gave Speaker Johnson that political cover to get the aid through. He didn't want to inherit a collapsing Ukraine.
He had him down in Mar-a-Lago.
Yes, no, it was all staged.
Yeah.
It was all staged. And what he said to Marjorie Taylor Greene, who was threatening to bring down the speaker, said, give it a rest.
I mean, you are right that things have changed a lot. A, we've had the invasion. B, European countries are already meeting their commitments.
I think there's 23 out of 32 NATO members.
Yeah, not quite all of them, but yes. One thing I couldn't help notice there about Mitch McConnell's address was, he was talking about American leadership, but he also, I think, towards the end, was giving a not so subtle hint to Europe about getting its own house in order in terms of industrial capacity. He said it quite a bit towards the end there about, I'm delighted to see Europe is investing in industrial capacity. And I think that was probably a kind of a reminder that, yes, America has done its bit in terms of getting this latest congressional package over the line, but Europe has to continue to invest more. And he seemed to be talking about the defence industry in particular.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And to be clear, the EU has put aside some funds for this, and many countries are now investing more. But the facts are that Europe has underinvested in defense spending, and defense spending is what drives defense production for 30 years. And so we're at a big deficit now when it comes to Russia's ability to put artillery and weapons and things into the fight in Ukraine. And what if that's not the only thing we have to worry about? If Russia succeeds, if Putin succeeds in Ukraine, as we heard earlier today from Anders Fogh Rasmussen, we're going to see conflict elsewhere. So we have to actually really step up dramatically As he said, we have to wake up that we're not in the same situation we were in even just a couple of years ago. We've got to do, all of us have got to do a lot more right now if we want to prevent future war.
Yes, interesting. Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, arrived in Kiev this morning, and I was just looking at some of his comments there, and he was very careful not to link the current challenges facing Ukraine in the northeast of the country with the delayed US aid. But, you know, we've all heard, we all know that, I mean, Mr. Rasmussen, in an interview with me for today's Politico Playbook, made that point that he thinks, no doubt, that Vladimir Putin exploited this delay in terms of the military aid coming from the US side. But there's another visit happening, which is President Putin has announced he's going to be visiting China this week. We've heard a lot about China in different forums here today, but what's your view on China's role in this war in terms of either, as you say, you know, supporting Russia or ultimately, you know, being part of some kind of solution to this?
All right, two pieces here. Let me start on the Ukraine piece because it's important. What Anders and Andriy Yermak put out today, this report, is very important, and not just for the fact that it says invite Ukraine to join NATO through beginning accession talks, lift the restrictions on the types of weapons, lift the restrictions on the use of weapons. Because not only was the delay part of why we see these Russian gains near Kharkiv now, also the fact that we tell the Ukrainians don't hit back.
Yeah,
that has to stop. And then the one thing I hope Tony is listening to us here in Copenhagen, I doubt it, but the one thing I really wish he would say in Ukraine is that it is the U.S. objective for Ukraine to win this war. Let's make that clear and then do everything working backwards to make sure that happens. As for your question about China, I don't think China is invested in Russia's war against Ukraine. It's not their war. I think they're actually embarrassed by it. They're embarrassed by the brutality and the atrocities. They're embarrassed by being aligned with Putin while he does that. And they don't want people to equate China with that. China views its ambitions in taking over Taiwan as legitimate, as part of a single China, and they want it to be done as peacefully and with as little resistance as possible. So they don't want to emulate what Russia is doing against Ukraine. However, they do, as we heard from all of the speakers, they do want to see the destruction of a Western liberal order in the world. And to the extent that Russia's belligerent behavior contributes to that, that's fine with them. They're not going to take part in sanctions against Russia. They're not going to exclude themselves from the world. They just have their own agenda and their own views. Sometimes Russia helps advance Chinese interests, sometimes they don't. China will play a long game.
A long game, I think, is a very apt note to finish on. Ambassador Volker, thanks very much for your insights, and thanks earlier to the Senate Minority Leader, Mitch McConnell.
Thank you.
I'm going to pass over to our next item now. We will shortly be joined by Masih Alinejad. But first, please look at your screens for a short video.